The coastal town of Cape Coast, known for its lively markets, the sound of waves crashing against the shore, and the rich scent of salt in the air, held more than just stories of trade and history. It was a place where the sun painted the town with golden hues each dawn, casting its light on fishing boats swaying gently in the tide and vendors setting up their stalls to sell everything from fresh plantains to woven Kent cloth. Amidst this vibrant life, 15-year-old Efua lived a life marked by dreams and the silent, unyielding expectations of her parents. Efua sat by the window of their modest wooden house, watching as the first rays of sunlight kissed the rooftops and chased away the coolness of the night. The rhythmic sounds of the sea mingled with the calls of fishermen readying their boats, a familiar melody that stirred her heart with both comfort and longing. The day would begin as it always did, with chores, school, and her father's stern reminders of the future she was expected to uphold. Efua. Kofi's deep voice, like the low rumble of an impending storm, called from outside. The weight of responsibility in that single word was as heavy as the fishing nets he handled every day. Kofi, a fisherman whose hands were as calloused as the rocky shore, stood by the open doorway, his expression unreadable. His eyes, dark and penetrating, met hers with an intensity that made her straighten unconsciously. "Yes, Papa," she answered, pushing herself up from the wooden stool. She felt the chill of the floor beneath her bare feet, grounding her as she took a deep breath and stepped outside. The morning air was thick with the familiar scent of salt and smoked fish. Kofi was cleaning his nets, the rough fibers tugging at his worn hands. He glanced at his daughter, pride and concern warring in the creases of his sun-beaten face. "Remember what I've always told you," he said, his voice serious as he paused his work. "These books are your key to the future. Don't let anything distract you." The words wrapped around Efua like the fishing nets in her father's hands, tight, restricting, and inescapable. She nodded, casting a fleeting glance at the narrow street where vendors were already setting up their stalls and children darted past, their laughter bright and carefree. How she longed to join them, to run without thinking, without the weight of her parents' dreams pressing on her shoulders. Inside the house, Mommy Asi, her mother, hummed softly as she stitched a new dress by the window. Her deft fingers moved with practiced ease, pulling the thread tight as if with each stitch she could mend the invisible seams of their lives. She looked up when Efua stepped in, her eyes softening with a love that spoke louder than any words. "Efua, make sure you have everything you need for school," Mommy Asi said, her voice a gentle balance to Kofi's stern tone. "And eat before you leave. You need your strength." The small table in the corner held a bowl of porridge, still steaming. Efua's stomach fluttered, not with hunger but with a nervous energy that had been growing inside her. She took a seat and glanced at the framed photograph on the wall, her parents on their wedding day, young and hopeful, Kofi standing tall with pride, Mame Iasai beaming as if she could hold the world together with her smile. "Thank you, Ma," Efua said, the words feeling almost mechanical as she spooned the porridge into her mouth. The sweetness did little to calm the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. Beneath her parents' watchful eyes, she was the dutiful daughter, but beneath her calm facade, another world called to her, a world where Kwabena's smile and whispered dreams waited by the old baobab tree at the village's edge. Efua's days were a delicate dance of meeting expectations and masking her true desires. The scent of Mame Iasai's porridge lingered as she stepped outside, the early morning sun casting a golden light on the village that hummed with life. The small path leading to her school was lined with vendors hawking their goods, their voices blending into a chorus of trade and greetings. Colorful fabrics swayed in the breeze, and baskets of fresh tomatoes and peppers added bursts of red and green to the dusty street. "Efua, hurry up, or you'll be late," called Efua, a schoolmate with wide, eager eyes and a smile that could outshine the sun. Efua waved, her heart lifting at the sight of her friend, but her steps remained measured. The burden of her father's warning followed her like a shadow. As she walked, the chatter of her peers drifted by, snippets of gossip, stories of mischief, and laughter unburdened by the worries that clouded her mind. Efua forced herself to join in their conversations, nodding and laughing at the right moments, but the secrets she held lay heavy in the silence between their words. The school itself, a modest building with cracked walls and faded paint, stood as a symbol of hope for many families in Cape Coast. It was here that dreams were nurtured and ambitions took root, and Efua, with her sharp mind and relentless curiosity, was among the brightest students. Yet, even as she absorbed the lessons of arithmetic and literature, her thoughts often strayed to the old baobab tree and the boy who waited there. Kwabena had a way of turning the ordinary into something electric. His voice, smooth as river stones, carried stories that painted vivid pictures in Efua's mind, stories of bustling streets in Accra where lights glittered like stars and opportunities whispered from every corner. He spoke of places where the sea wasn't just a source of survival but a gateway to new worlds. To Efua, those stories were more than mere words, they were glimpses of freedom, tinged with danger and allure. Efua, pay attention. The sharp voice of Madame Oforaway, her teacher, cut through her daydream. Efua's cheeks flushed as the class turned to look at her, curiosity and amusement sparking in their eyes. She muttered an apology and focused on the chalkboard, where a math problem waited unsolved. After school, the walk home felt longer. The golden afternoon light deepened into shades of amber, casting long shadows that reached for her as she passed. Children played with makeshift toys, their shouts echoing off the clay walls of homes. Efua's heart quickened with each step that brought her closer to the baobab tree, that sacred place where she could shed the skin of duty and be just a girl with dreams as wide as the ocean. When she arrived, the tree stood tall and ancient, its gnarled branches stretching toward the sky. The bark, carved with the names and memories of lovers and friends, whispered secrets older than any living soul. There, in the filtered light of the setting sun, Kwabena waited. His smile, bright and mischievous, was like the first cool breeze after a stifling day. "You're late," he teased, the corners of his eyes crinkling in a way that made Efua's breath catch. "I couldn't leave right after school," she said, folding her arms in mock indignation. "Papa would notice." Kwabena laughed, the sound rich and carefree, filling the space between them. He reached for her hand, the touch sending a thrill through her that she couldn't quite explain. It was at moments like these that the walls of her world shifted, the boundaries between responsibility and desire blurring like the horizon at dusk. "I've been thinking," Kwabena said, his voice softening as his gaze wandered beyond the tree's branches, where the sky darkened into a deep, velvety blue. "One day, Efua, we'll leave this place. We'll go to Accra, where the streets are alive, and no one can tell us who to be." The promise in his words, bold and reckless, made her chest tighten. Part of her longed to believe him, to let the dream carry her beyond the confines of Cape Coast. But then there was the voice of Kofi, as steady and inescapable as the tide, reminding her of the life planned for her. "How?" she whispered, the question tasting of both hope and doubt. "How can we leave when everything we know is here?" Kwabena turned to her, his eyes alight with that unyielding confidence that seemed to belong to another world. "We just have to be brave enough," he said. His hand squeezed hers, grounding her, challenging her. The wind rustled through the leaves of the baobab tree, carrying the mingled scents of salt, earth, and the faintest trace of wood smoke from the village. Efua's heart pounded in her chest, caught between the familiarity of home and the pull of the unknown. In the distance, the calls of fishermen echoed as they returned with their day's catch, a reminder of the life waiting for her just beyond the clearing. "Brave enough," she repeated, the words a whisper, a promise, a question. They lingered in the air as the sky deepened to indigo, the first stars appearing like scattered fireflies. Soon, she would have to return home, to the small wooden house where her parents waited with stories of their own sacrifices, stories she was bound to uphold. But for now, under the watchful eye of the baobab tree, she let herself dream, even as a seed of worry took root in her heart, a silent harbinger of the storm that was to come. As the stars multiplied across the sky, Efua walked home, each step heavy with the weight of her secret meetings and the words Kwabena had whispered. The path that led back to her house was familiar, lined with hibiscus and wildflowers that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The scents of the evening, the heady perfume of night-blooming jasmine and the tang of salt from the nearby sea, wrapped around her, soothing and unsettling her in equal measure. When she reached home, the wooden door creaked as she pushed it open. The warm, amber glow of the lantern cast long shadows across the room, dancing over the walls lined with woven mats and photographs. Kofi sat at the small table, his strong frame hunched as he mended one of his fishing nets by the dim light. His hands, large and roughened by years of work, moved with surprising gentleness as he wove the fibers together, patching the holes left by the day's battle with the sea. "You're late," he said, without looking up. His voice was steady but carried an undertone of something deeper, concern, perhaps, or a silent warning. The creases around his eyes deepened as he glanced at her, eyes dark and knowing. "I stayed after school to help Madame Oforaway," Efua replied, her voice calm, practiced. Lies had a way of slipping off her tongue more easily now, each one a small betrayal that chipped away at her sense of self. Kofi's gaze lingered for a moment longer, searching her face for signs of deceit. Finally, he nodded, turning his attention back to his task. The rhythmic sound of the net being pulled and tightened filled the silence between them, punctuated by the distant murmur of the sea. "Go wash up, and then come eat," Mame Esai called from the kitchen, her voice soft but insistent. The aroma of stewed okra and fried fish drifted through the small home, stirring a pang of guilt in Efua's chest. Her mother's care was stitched into every meal, every neatly folded cloth, every word spoken in love or worry. Efua washed her hands at the basin near the doorway, the cool water washing away the dirt of the day but not the ache in her heart. She joined her parents at the table, the small space filling with the sounds of spoons against bowls and the quiet hum of evening conversation. "You did well in school today?" Mame Esai asked, a habitual question, her eyes watching for any flicker of discomfort. "Yes, Ma," Efua said, forcing a smile. The weight of expectation pressed down on her, making it hard to swallow the food that suddenly felt like stones in her mouth. She glanced at the photograph on the wall, the one of her mother, young and bright-eyed at her sewing machine. The fabric of their lives was woven with dreams of a better future, each thread a sacrifice she was meant to honor. After dinner, as Kofi checked the fishing gear one last time and Mame Esai tidied up, Efua retreated to her small room. The room was simple, with a narrow bed draped in a colorful Kent cloth and a small desk where her schoolbooks lay open. She lit a candle and sat down, running her fingers over the worn pages, the words blurring as her thoughts spiraled. Kwabena's face appeared in her mind, his voice echoing with promises and dreams too big for their small world. She touched the worn wood of the desk, tracing the grooves made by her pencil during long hours of studying. The desk was a gift from Kofi, carved with his own hands, a symbol of his belief in her. It felt like both a lifeline and a chain. A soft knock at the door startled her, and Mame Esai stepped in, her silhouette framed by the flickering candlelight. Her mother's eyes, so like her own, searched her face with a gentleness that made Efua's throat tighten. "Are you all right, my child?" Mame Esai asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, Ma," Efua replied, forcing another smile that didn't reach her eyes. She hoped the dim light would hide the tremble in her voice, the way her hands fidgeted with the edge of her book. Mame Esai reached out and touched Efua's cheek, the warmth of her hand a reminder of all the love and sacrifices that had brought them here. "Sleep well, Efua," she said, a hint of worry creasing her brow before she turned and left the room. The door closed softly, and the night seemed to close in around Efua. She turned to the small window beside her bed and looked out at the sky, where the stars scattered like tiny, unreachable beacons. The old baobab tree loomed in her memory, a guardian of secrets that now felt too heavy for its branches alone to bear. As she lay down, the quiet of the room was interrupted only by the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. The question from earlier returned, unbidden, echoing in the stillness, how brave is brave enough? And what would it cost her to find out? The night deepened, the village wrapped in its embrace, unaware of the storm brewing in the heart of a 15-year-old girl who stood at the precipice of love, betrayal, and choices that would change everything. The days slipped by like grains of sand through Efua's fingers. Cape Coast was alive with the chatter of merchants, the laughter of children, and the steady rhythm of life by the sea. Yet, beneath the surface of her routine, Efua felt the undercurrent of change, an unspoken tension that tightened her chest with each passing day. At school, Madame Oforaway's lessons seemed to blur together, the steady cadence of her voice lulling the class into the comfort of familiarity. But Efua's mind was elsewhere, tugged constantly toward the old baobab tree and the weight of Kwabena's words. When the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Efua gathered her books slowly, her hands shaking just enough for her to notice. "You've been quiet lately," Efua said, appearing at Efua's side. Her eyes, sharp and full of curiosity, searched Efua's face. Efua was the kind of friend who noticed everything, from the ink stains on Efua's fingers to the slight tremor in her voice. Just tired, Efua lied, forcing a smile that faltered under Efua's gaze. You should come with us to the river this weekend, Efua pressed. It will be good for you to relax. I'll try, Efua replied, knowing full well that she wouldn't. The river was a place of laughter and games, but her heart was too restless, too caught in the storm of what-ifs. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Efua took the familiar path home, her schoolbooks tucked tightly under her arm. The air was heavy with the scent of roasting corn and fried plantains, and the sound of a drumbeat from the far side of the market pulsed in the distance. She passed vendors who called out to her, their voices mingling with the clamor of buyers haggling over prices. Each step toward home was measured, deliberate, as if she could slow down the inevitable. When she reached the small wooden house, Kofi was already outside, patching the holes in his fishing net with practiced hands. His face, lined with the stories of days spent at sea, softened as he saw her approach. The sun cast a golden glow over his weathered features, illuminating the quiet pride in his eyes. Welcome home, Efua, he said, his voice deep and steady. Thank you, Papa, she replied, bending to touch his arm, a gesture of respect that felt heavier than usual. The warmth of his skin beneath her fingertips made the guilt coil tighter in her chest. Inside, Mame Esi hummed softly as she sorted through a pile of fabric, her nimble fingers selecting the brightest cloth for her latest project. The sound of her mother's humming had always been a source of comfort, a thread that stitched their lives together even when the world outside threatened to pull them apart. Efua, come and help me with the hems, Mame Esi called, glancing up with a smile that reached her eyes. There was a peace in her mother's presence, a steadiness that had kept their family whole through years of hardship. Efua set her books down and joined her, the needle and thread feeling both familiar and foreign in her hands. Each stitch was an act of precision, a reminder of the life she was expected to lead. As the evening shadows deepened and the stars began to pierce the sky, the small house filled with the quiet sounds of home, Mame Esi's soft humming, the rhythmic scraping of Kofi's knife against a block of wood, the creak of the floorboards under Efua's shifting weight. It was a symphony of normalcy, one that made her heart ache with its simplicity. But normalcy was fleeting. That night, as Efua lay in bed, the memory of Kwabena's touch and the fire in his eyes played on a loop behind her closed lids. The whispers of their secret meetings, the promises that felt too big to hold, gnawed at her. The thought of leaving Cape Coast, of stepping into the unknown, was both thrilling and terrifying. The next afternoon, as the sun reached its zenith and the market bustled with life, Efua found herself at the edge of the village, near the baobab tree. The giant stood sentinel, its branches spreading wide as if to cradle the secrets etched into its bark. Kwabena was there, leaning against the ancient tree with the kind of confidence that drew attention like a flame in the dark. His smile was wide as he saw her, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink until it was just the two of them under the canopy of leaves. You came, he said, stepping closer. His eyes sparkled with mischief, but there was something else there too, something deeper, a shadow that flickered behind the bravado. I shouldn't be here, Efua whispered, her voice trembling as she looked over her shoulder. The path back to the village was empty, but the fear of being caught was as real as the heartbeat thudding in her chest. But you are, Kwabena replied, reaching for her hand. His touch was warm, grounding her in the present even as her mind raced ahead to consequences she dared not name. Efua, do you ever wonder what life could be if we just took a chance? The question hung in the air, heavy and tantalizing. She thought of her father's voice, the creases of worry in her mother's brow, the hope stitched into every seam of their lives. And then she thought of the stories Kwabena told, of Accra, with its sprawling markets, gleaming lights, and the promise of freedom. Every day, she admitted, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. Kwabena's smile softened, and he cupped her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Then let's find a way. You and me. We can be more than what this place has planned for us. The leaves above them rustled as a breeze passed through, carrying the scent of salt and earth. For a heartbeat, the world stilled, and it felt as though even the ancient tree listened, holding its breath. A sudden shout in the distance shattered the moment. Efua jumped, her pulse racing as she pulled back from Kwabena's touch. The path leading to the village was no longer empty, a small group of children ran by, their laughter breaking the silence. She let out a shaky breath, the spell broken but the promise still lingering like an echo. "I have to go," she said, stepping back. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders once more, but this time, it was tinged with something new, a spark of defiance. Kwabena's eyes held hers, searching for a sign that the moment had not been lost. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice low, urgent. "Meet me here tomorrow." Efua hesitated, the word balancing on the edge of her tongue. And then, with a quick nod, she turned and walked away, the rough bark of the baobab tree pressing into her palm as a silent promise. As she made her way back to the village, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that seemed to follow her, whispering of choices yet to be made and sacrifices yet to come. The next day, the sky was a brilliant blue, streaked with wisps of white that moved lazily in the midday heat. Cape Coast bustled with life as usual, the market a vibrant tapestry of colors, sounds, and scents. Women balanced baskets of fruit on their heads, calling out prices to passers-by, while children darted between the stalls, their laughter echoing off the clay walls of nearby buildings. Efua's heart thudded as she navigated the narrow paths between vendors, her schoolbooks clutched tightly to her chest. The promise she had made to meet Kwabena weighed on her mind like an anchor. Each step felt heavier than the last, and every face she passed seemed to watch her with knowing eyes. The guilt of secrets she carried prickled at her skin, a constant reminder of the tightrope she walked between duty and desire. She reached the edge of the village just as the sun began its slow descent, casting a warm, golden light over the landscape. The baobab tree stood waiting, its broad branches stretching toward the sky, silhouetted against the waning light. Kwabena was there, leaning against the tree's thick trunk, his arms folded and a playful smile tugging at his lips. "You're late," he teased, but his eyes searched hers, looking for the reason behind her hesitation. "I almost didn't come," Efua admitted, the truth ringing between them. Her fingers dug into the worn covers of her schoolbooks, seeking the stability that felt so far out of reach. Kwabena's smile softened, and he stepped closer. The space between them crackled with an unspoken energy, the air charged with questions neither dared to voice. "But you did," he said, the words an invitation, a reassurance. The wind shifted, carrying the distant call of fishermen and the scent of the sea. The sound of waves crashing against the shore was a constant hum, a reminder of the boundaries of their world. For a moment, Efua closed her eyes, letting the breeze wash over her face and tangle in her hair. When she opened them, Kwabena's gaze was steady, his expression serious in a way that made her heart stutter. "Efua, I know it's hard to believe, but there's a world beyond this," he said, his voice low and fervent. He reached out, his fingers brushing hers. "A world where we don't have to follow the path others have laid out for us. Where we can be who we choose to be." The intensity in his words tugged at something deep within her. The quiet girl who sat dutifully in class, who listened to her father's warnings and accepted her mother's silent prayers, felt a crack form in the walls she had built around herself. But with that crack came fear, fear of what lay beyond, of what stepping into the unknown might cost her. But what about Papa? And Mame? Efua's voice was barely above a whisper, the weight of her parents' expectations pressing on her chest like a stone. Kwabena's expression softened, and he stepped back, giving her space. "I know they mean everything to you. But Efua, you can't live your whole life for them. There has to be something for you, too." His eyes, usually so full of mischief, were earnest now, pleading. "We don't have to leave tomorrow, or even next month. But we need to start thinking about it. Promise me you'll think about it." Efua swallowed hard, the warmth of his words wrapping around her like a blanket, both comforting and suffocating. The sky above them darkened as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the world in shades of purple and orange. The first stars appeared, tentative and distant, like tiny eyes watching their secret meeting. "I'll think about it," she said finally, the words feeling like both a betrayal and a promise. She looked at Kwabena, searching for some sign that this path was worth the risk, that the stories he told of Accra and the world beyond were more than just dreams spun out of longing. A smile spread across Kwabena's face, relief softening his features. "That's all I ask," he said, his voice lightening as if he had already won a victory. He reached out, tracing a small heart into the bark of the baobab tree with his finger. "This tree has seen everything, hasn't it?" he murmured, a grin tugging at his lips. "Yes," Efua replied, a small smile breaking through the storm inside her. "It holds our secrets." "And it will keep them," Kwabena said, his eyes meeting hers with a confidence that made her believe, just for a moment, that maybe they could be brave enough. That maybe the world outside Cape Coast held something for them after all. The sound of voices in the distance brought them back to the present. The fishermen were returning from the sea, their boats skimming over the waves as they shouted to one another, the day's catch glistening in the last light of the sun. The spell was broken, the moment of fragile hope shattered by the reality that pressed on all sides. "I should go," Efua said, her heart thrumming in her chest. The urgency of getting home before the questions could start propelled her away from the tree, but she paused and looked back at Kwabena. "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," he confirmed, the word a lifeline thrown across the space between them. As Efua walked back toward the village, the golden light faded, replaced by the deeper hues of twilight. The narrow streets were quieter now, the market stalls shuttered, and the scent of smoked fish mingled with the cool breeze off the ocean. Her home, with its warm glow and familiar creaks, waited for her, a place of comfort and confinement. Kofi's silhouette was visible through the window, bent over a fishing net, the lines of his face etched with the focus of a man who had spent his life mastering the relentless sea. Mame Esi was at her sewing table, her head bent over a dress, the lamplight casting a halo over her graying hair. "Efua," her father's voice called as she stepped inside, and the weight of the world seemed to settle on her shoulders once more. "Yes, Papa," she answered, the crack in her voice barely noticeable, but they're all the same. As she took her seat at the small table for supper, she felt the echo of Kwabena's words in her heart, "We can be more than what this place has planned for us." And as the night wrapped Cape Coast in its familiar embrace, Efua wondered if the cost of those dreams would be more than she could bear. The days that followed were marked by a new tension that hummed under the surface of Efua's life. She moved through her routines at home and school with the practiced ease of someone carrying a secret too heavy to share. But the knowledge of her clandestine meetings with Kwabena weighed on her like the steady thrum of a drumbeat, loudest in the quiet moments. Cape Coast remained unchanged, its narrow streets bustling with life, the sea a constant backdrop, whispering stories older than time. Vendors called out their wares as women bartered with sharp tongues and knowing smiles. Fishermen worked with the rhythmic unity of those who had known the sea all their lives, their voices carrying over the crash of the waves. But for Efua, everything felt sharper, more vivid, as if the world itself knew she stood on the edge of something that would change her forever. It was on one of these days, when the sun shone so brightly that the air seemed to shimmer, that Efua noticed Mame Esi's eyes following her more closely. The way her mother's gaze lingered, soft with concern and sharp with suspicion, made the hair on Efua's neck stand on end. Mame Esi had always been perceptive, her intuition a quiet force that had kept their family steady. "You've been restless, Efua," Mame Esi said one evening, her voice gentle as she threaded a needle. The golden light of the lantern played across her face, highlighting the fine lines at the corners of her eyes. Efua's fingers stilled on the book in her lap, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm fine, Ma," she replied, keeping her voice light, careful. Her mother's hands paused in their work, the silence between them growing thick. "Restlessness can lead to trouble, my child. Remember what your father says, focus on your studies. They are the path to a better life." "Yes, Ma," Efua said, the words feeling hollow as they left her lips. The small room seemed to shrink around her, the walls pressing in, each breath harder to take. She excused herself and slipped outside, the cool night air washing over her like a balm. The village was quieter at night, the market's chaos replaced by the distant lull of the sea and the chirping of crickets. Efua walked to the edge of the village, where the path met the beach. She stood there, the sand cool beneath her feet, and watched the waves roll in, their foam-tipped edges glowing under the moonlight. "Efua," a voice called softly, startling her. She turned to see Kwabena stepping out from the shadow of a palm tree. His smile was wide, but it didn't reach his eyes, which were dark and searching. "You shouldn't be here," she said, though her heart betrayed her with its quickened pace. The night held them in a cocoon of silence, broken only by the whisper of the sea. "I had to see you," he said, taking a step closer. The space between them was charged with everything unsaid, the dreams shared under the baobab tree, the stolen glances in the market, the fear that grew like a vine around her heart. For a moment, they stood in silence, the moon casting a silver glow on the beach, painting their shadows long and thin. Kwabena reached for her hand, his touch warm and familiar. "I've heard about a group that helps young people find work in Accra," he said, his voice low, urgent. "They can get us there, Efua. We could leave before the year is out." The words hung between them, heavy with possibility. Efua's breath caught in her throat, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She thought of Kofi, his rough hands mending nets, and the pride in his eyes when he spoke of her future. She thought of Mame Esi's careful stitching, each seam a prayer for their family's safety and prosperity. Leaving would mean tearing apart the fabric of their lives. "Are you sure?" she whispered, her voice trembling. It was the closest she had come to admitting that the thought of leaving terrified her, that the promise of freedom was laced with fear. Kwabena nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm sure. But I won't force you. If you stay, I stay." The sincerity in his eyes made her chest ache. She looked away, her gaze falling to the waves as they reached for the shore, only to be pulled back into the vastness of the sea. The decision before her was as relentless as the tide, an unstoppable force that would sweep her into the unknown or leave her clinging to the safety of the shore. "I need time," she said finally, the words barely a whisper over the sound of the sea. Kwabena's grip on her hand tightened for a moment before he let go. "Take all the time you need," he said, stepping back, his expression unreadable. He turned and walked into the shadows, leaving her alone under the wide, starlit sky. The night air chilled her, and Efua wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the emptiness of the space Kwabena had left. Above her, the stars seemed to pulse with a knowing light, as if they were the eyes of ancestors watching, waiting. The sea whispered at her feet, an endless reminder of choices made and the ones yet to come. When Efua returned home, the house was dark, save for the soft glow of the lantern in her room. She moved quietly so as not to wake her parents and sat on the edge of her bed, the silence pressing in on her. The night's events played in her mind, each word, each look, replaying with sharp clarity. The book she had left on her desk lay open, its pages fluttering as a breeze swept through the window. She reached out and ran her fingers over the printed words, their meaning lost in the whirlwind of her thoughts. The promise of the future, so carefully planned by Kofi and Mame Esi, was now at war with the spark of desire Kwabena had ignited. A desire not just for him, but for a life that was hers alone to claim. As she lay down, the question that had haunted her for days whispered through the stillness, how brave was brave enough? And in the space between one heartbeat and the next, she wondered if she would ever find the answer. The morning light filtered through the small window, casting long rays that painted the room in shades of amber and gold. Efua awoke to the familiar sound of the sea in the distance, its rhythmic crash against the shore both comforting and daunting. Today felt different, heavy with an unspoken anticipation that sat like a stone in her chest. "Efua, are you up?" Mame Esi's voice called from the kitchen, the gentle clatter of dishes accompanying her words. "Yes, Ma," Efua replied, forcing her voice to sound steady. She rose from her bed, the Kent cloth slipping from her shoulders as she stretched. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of salt and the faint aroma of smoked fish from the market. She dressed quickly and stepped into the main room, where the warm glow of the lanterns cast a soft light over her mother's familiar figure. Mame Esi looked up, her eyes softening when they met Efua's. "Eat quickly, child. You'll need your strength for today's lessons," she said, placing a bowl of steaming porridge on the table. Her hands, roughened from years of sewing and caring for their home, lingered on the edge of the bowl as if to pass on some unspoken comfort. "Thank you, Ma," Efua said, taking her seat. She stirred the porridge absently, her mind wandering to Kwabena's words from the night before. "A world where we don't have to follow the path others have laid out for us." The thought made her pulse quicken, but guilt shadowed the flicker of excitement. Kofi entered the room, his presence commanding even in the early morning quiet. He nodded to Efua, his eyes sharp and assessing. "You seem troubled, Efua," he said, settling into his chair. His voice carried the weight of someone who had faced the relentless sea and returned each day to fight again. I'm just thinking about school, Efua lied, her gaze dropping to her bowl. The silence stretched, broken only by the gentle creak of the wooden chair as Kofi leaned forward. School is important, but so is your spirit, Kofi said, surprising her. His eyes, dark as the depths of the ocean, softened for a moment. You must carry both with strength, Efua. The words, simple yet profound, lingered in the air as Efua finished her breakfast. They were a reminder of the life her parents had carved out with their bare hands, a life built on resilience and quiet hope. But that hope had boundaries, ones that Efua felt pressing in on her more each day. When she left for school, the morning sun was already high, warming the path beneath her feet. The village buzzed with its usual life, vendors calling out prices, the metallic clink of coins exchanging hands, and the occasional squawk of chickens escaping their pens. Efua joined her along the way, her chatter a welcome distraction from the storm brewing inside. Did you hear about the festival next week? Efua asked, her eyes bright with excitement. There will be music, dancing, even storytellers from Accra. Efua's heart fluttered at the mention of Accra, the city that had become a beacon in Kwabena's stories and her own daydreams. Yes, I heard, she said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The thought of the festival, with its joyous chaos and promise of something beyond the ordinary, stirred a mix of hope and dread within her. The day's lessons passed in a blur, Madame Oforuwe's voice blending with the whispers of students and the soft scrape of chalk against the board. By the time the sun dipped low, casting long, golden shadows, Efua's thoughts had wandered far from the classroom. When the final bell rang, she gathered her things and slipped away before Efua could ask any more questions. The path to the baobab tree was lined with memories, moments stolen from the fabric of her routine, stitched with laughter, whispered dreams, and the thrill of being seen for who she truly was. Kwabena was already there, sitting on one of the tree's wide, twisted roots, his face lit with the last light of day. You're here, he said, standing as she approached. The tension in his shoulders eased, replaced by a smile that made her heart stutter. I'm here, Efua replied, the words feeling heavier than they should. The leaves rustled above them, carrying the scent of the sea and the faint hum of the village behind them. Kwabena reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and warm. I spoke to the man who arranges work in Accra, he said, his voice low and urgent. He said there's an opportunity for us if we're serious. We'd need to leave soon, within the month. The ground seemed to shift beneath Efua's feet, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She looked into Kwabena's eyes, searching for answers, but found only hope and the same fear she felt reflected back at her. The thought of Accra, with its bustling streets and glittering lights, called to a part of her that longed for more. But it also carried the threat of leaving behind everything she had ever known. Within the month, she echoed, the words barely a breath. Yes, Kwabena said, squeezing her hand. I know it's fast, but this is our chance, Efua. It may not come again. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of voices from the village, familiar, grounding. She thought of Kofi's steady presence, Mame Esi's careful watch, and the life built on their sacrifices. The choice before her was stark, the safety of what she knew or the uncertain promise of what could be. I'll give you my answer soon, she said, her voice trembling with the weight of the promise. Kwabena nodded, understanding in his eyes. Whatever you decide, I'll be here. As the first stars pricked the deepening sky, Efua turned to leave, the old baobab tree standing behind her, witness to another secret woven into its ancient bark. The path back to the village felt longer, each step echoing with the rhythm of her heartbeat. The scent of smoke and fried plantains drifted through the air as she neared her home, the sounds of nightfall settling over Cape Coast like a familiar song. She pushed open the door to find Kofi sitting by the window, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He turned when he heard her, the lines on his face deepening as he studied her. Did you have a good day? He asked, the question carrying more weight than usual. Yes, Papa, she said, the lie settling in her chest like a stone. The night wrapped around the house, carrying the whispers of the sea and the question that haunted Efua's mind, was she brave enough to step into the unknown? And if she did, could she bear the cost? Days passed, each one heavier than the last, as Efua's world began to unravel at the edges. It started with a subtle change, exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin, an unsettled feeling deep in her stomach. At first, she attributed it to stress, the weight of school, and the silent battle between her heart and the expectations placed on her. But soon, the signs became undeniable. One morning, as the first light of dawn crept through the window, Efua sat on the edge of her bed, her body trembling. The nausea had been worse that day, leaving her breathless and hollowed out. She pressed a hand to her stomach, a cold realization washing over her like the incoming tide. The truth that she had pushed down, buried beneath denial and hope, surfaced with stark clarity. "I am pregnant." The words echoed in her mind, a silent confession that made her blood run cold. Panic flared, hot and bright, stealing the air from her lungs. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the schoolbooks stacked neatly on her desk, the frayed edges of her Kent blanket, the small window that framed the morning sky. Everything seemed sharper, more vivid, as if the world had tilted and left her clinging to the edge. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. "This can't be." But the sickness, the fatigue, the tightness in her chest, all of it pointed to the truth she could no longer ignore. Tears pricked her eyes, and she buried her face in her hands, the fear coiling tight in her stomach. That day at school, Efua's behavior shifted. She moved through the lessons like a ghost, her gaze unfocused and her responses automatic. Efua noticed, concern flaring in her eyes, but Efua brushed off her friend's questions with a weak smile and vague excuses. The classroom, once a place of ambition and possibility, now felt suffocating, the chalkboard's equations blurring as her mind raced with what-ifs and impossible choices. The days that followed were a blur of dread and whispered denials. Each time Efua glanced at her reflection in the window or felt the queasiness twist in her gut, the reality bore down on her. She needed to tell Kwabena, needed to share this burden that threatened to crush her. But how would he react? The question gnawed at her, leaving her sleepless and frayed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the village, she made her way to the baobab tree. The air was thick with the scent of the sea, and the voices of the fishermen returning with their catch carried in the distance. Kwabena was already there, pacing beneath the sprawling branches. When he saw her, he smiled, but it faltered when he noticed the strain on her face. "Efua, what's wrong?" he asked, stepping forward. She swallowed, her throat tight. The words felt heavy, lodged in her chest, but she forced them out. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. "Kwabena, I think I'm pregnant." For a moment, there was only silence. Kwabena's smile fell away, replaced by a stunned expression that made Efua's heart pound. He took a step back, as if the distance could erase what he had just heard. "Pregnant?" he echoed, disbelief and fear darkening his eyes. "Are you sure?" Efua nodded, the weight of his reaction pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. "I'm sure," she whispered. Kwabena's jaw clenched, and he turned away, running a hand through his hair. "This can't be happening," he muttered, more to himself than to her. The confident, charming boy who spoke of adventure and freedom now looked like a cornered animal, his gaze darting around as if searching for an escape. "Kwabena, please," Efua said, reaching out to him, but he stepped out of reach, his eyes hardening. "I don't know what you expect me to do," he said, his voice cold. "I have plans, Efua. I can't throw everything away for this." The words struck her like a blow, and she recoiled, her hand falling to her side. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back, anger and betrayal sparking in her chest. "And what about me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What about our plans?" Kwabena's silence was answer enough. He looked at her, his expression softening for a moment before the fear returned. "I can't do this, Efua. I'm sorry." With that, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the twilight, leaving her alone beneath the ancient tree. The days that followed were a blur of fear, grief, and a growing sense of isolation. Efua avoided Efua's questions, skirted her parents' watchful eyes, and withdrew into herself. Every time she felt the flutter in her stomach, the truth came crashing back, she was alone in this. One evening, as she listened to the rhythmic scraping of Kofi's knife against a block of wood and the hum of Mame Esi's voice, a resolve began to form. She couldn't stay. The shame would be too much for her parents to bear, the questions from the village, the judgment, all of it would crush them. She would not be the daughter who brought disgrace to their name. Late that night, as the village slept under the blanket of stars, Efua packed a small bag. The weight of each item, a change of clothes, a few coins, a book she couldn't bear to leave behind, pressed on her, a silent reminder of what she was leaving behind. The house, with its creaking floorboards and warm, familiar scents, seemed to watch her, each shadow a memory, each breath a goodbye. Before she stepped out, she paused at the threshold, looking back at the small room where her parents lay sleeping. The faces that had been her whole world, that had loved her fiercely, would wake to an empty bed and unanswered questions. The guilt clawed at her, but she pushed it down. This was the only way. As she walked through the darkened streets, the sea whispered behind her, a sound that had always brought her comfort. But tonight, it felt like a farewell. The bus waited at the edge of the village, its metal frame cold and unyielding. She climbed aboard, her heart pounding as she took a seat by the window. The engine roared to life, and the village slipped away, the familiar sights blurring into the darkness. Efua looked back one last time, the silhouette of Cape Coast fading into the distance. The ache in her chest deepened, but so did her resolve. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to walk. The bus rumbled forward, carrying her toward Accra and a future she could not yet imagine, a future where she would fight not just for herself, but for the life growing within her. As the bus rattled down the winding road, an old woman seated across from her shifted, her dark eyes meeting Efua's. There was something unsettling in the way the woman stared, as if she could see beyond the surface, into the very core of Efua's being. The woman's lips parted, and in a voice that cracked like dry leaves, she whispered, "The journey will test you, child. And the price you pay may be more than you are willing to give." Efua's breath caught in her throat as a chill swept down her spine. She opened her mouth to respond, but the woman turned away, her eyes closing as if she'd never spoken at all. The bus plunged into the darkness of the road ahead, leaving only the faint glow of Cape Coast behind. And for the first time, Efua wondered if she had made the right choice, or if she had just stepped into a storm that would consume everything she knew.